Good afternoon. Well, it's overcast and the heat is gone now. It's 55, tolerable, but you can get spoiled by getting summer and spring heat and then being pushed back a little bit toward the chillier time of the year. There are all sorts of things going on. Today, of course, Sunday is the Talking Heads Day, in which there's a lot of talk about who should be president and stuff like that. There are a couple of stories that are interesting to me. There's a big hoo-ha about Afghanistan, implying that we shouldn't have left because there's a hotbed for terrorism again. And people seem to forget that, like Russia and the United States, for different reasons, we found we couldn't make the difference there we hoped to. And the reason that we'd gone there was a little late and too light, and that when we left, it almost proved why we shouldn't be there, because the government couldn't be trusted with the help and funds we gave them to maintain an armed force. And I don't know if there's a good and easy way to leave a nation state where you've been making war and trying to leave with your tail somewhat between your legs in retreat because you serve no useful continuing function there. But that's the kind of thing we get. And how are we going to deal with them in the future? Well, we do police actions, and maybe they're not the best, but they don't mean a big dedication of troops and treasure and blood from our youngest and from mercenaries. So I think it's a false story for us to be concerned about, because there's nothing that we can do about it. You know, if you have friends, persons of color who have children, you probably know about what they call the talk, which is a mother or father or both sit down with their child and they say, you, because you're a person of color, have to be careful. You have to be careful with police, because it's as if by prejudice or design, by bigotry, they will strike at you. They may hit you, they may unfairly charge you, they may kill you. And this speech has to be given so that the child is most careful and alert, and hopefully smart enough if they find themselves in that situation, so that their life, well-being, good name is not compromised at a young age, because we don't have a police officer, we don't have a peace officer, we have a Nazi dealing with the situation. Now, in recent days, we see there's another concern, that just by the color of your skin, a person of color is at risk if they accidentally push the wrong doorbell, drive into the wrong driveway. And that's not an acceptable place for our nation to be. But it's as real as the number of guns we have that couldn't be used and aren't used, seemingly except for a growing attitude toward violence as the initial strike, not to say, can I help you, son? What are you doing here? And so forth. I think of the 84-year-old man that tells us a story about he woke up and he was upset because he saw this boy. And we've seen the picture of the boy. There was nothing imposing or dangerous about him. The only thing that went through that sorry man's poor thinking mechanism, overclouded with a prejudice for any person of color, was that this is a person of color, a black boy in front of me, and so I'm going to shoot him. And he did. This is not acceptable in America, and increasingly the violence in our DNA is manifest because our laws are not enforced. And this has been a long time coming, because it's not just any one law, it's all of our laws are not being applied to those persons in privileged positions of power by wealth, by politics, by connection, by family history. And this has been made visible to America at the highest reaches when a man like Trump can try to overthrow our government, luckily fail, and we sit on our hands and don't do a damn thing about it. So, that's part of our problem. The presidency of Biden, some people are upset because it's not all they wanted to be. Well, perhaps I understand that, because when do we find everything that we think should be the American policy in a government? When do we find that that's what we have? There are always differences. There are differences in family. I have differences with Biden. But the one thing that's clear to me is that Biden is the only person who can defeat Trump or the Republicans. And there is no alternative now who has presented himself or herself who fits in that position. I did like Robert Kennedy Jr. in his early days when he was fighting for the environment. But it's like somebody turned off the switch in his head, and he now has kind of this loony view about vaccinations. Hard to understand. And why he's running for the presidency is beyond me. And, this is America. And some people said, no, we're settling for him. In my lifetime, I have seen the perfect be the enemy of the politically successful. I think back to when I was a kid, basically, and when Bobby Kennedy was killed, in the same year Martin Luther King was killed, and there was a Democratic convention, and Hubert Humphrey became the nominee, as a bloodbath rolled through the streets outside the convention center. The reaction afterwards was, we children were going to sit out that election. But I couldn't imagine anything then like Trump worse than Nixon. And because we were slow in supporting Humphrey over Nixon, we had Nixon. And that led to one more disaster because of whom Nixon was. And so now I see it myself today, and we have Biden. And we don't have anything like the troubles that were LBJ with regard to the Vietnam War among the Democrats. I mean, even in the last couple of days, Biden has tightened up emission standards on power plants. And that's a good thing. He's also weak in other areas. But as an approximation, and I don't know what that is, of who else we could have when we see so many cowardly politicians, frankly, I don't know if we would have any candidate who would be better if elected. And judging by the primary purposes, history teaches us you can't rely on what we're told in a primary, because then we're told in the general election, well, I have to say something more to get elected so that I can help you. But more than that, you shouldn't change a winning horse in midstream. He beat Trump once. He may not prosecute him, and I believe he's the reason there isn't a prosecution, because I don't think Garland would have the courage to do nothing, although I do know he has the cowardice to do nothing without the support of the president. So I think that Biden has the guts to go against Trump where other Democrats come up short. Or are interested out of ego or self-promotion. So that's my thinking. And lastly, there's an interesting phenomenon that's happening across the country. I don't know if you saw the story about West Olive, Michigan, in which a local town council was entirely replaced because they were going to thwart tyranny, which they claimed was the manner of the day in this town council. Now, okay, I understand that. But now, when these people get into power, despite what they said, they're even worse than the board they replaced. And that community is working through how they're going to do that. Firings of long-standing people without political profiles, And the spoil system can be very destructive and can destroy the structure that you claim to be coming into power to enliven, when instead you come into, quote, power, lose the power, and destroy what you had. And that may be what's going on. The final chapter hasn't been written on West Olive, Michigan. But the reason I picked this example out is because we see our institutions failing us. When a judge can try to overrule an abortion pill with an ancient statute which has itself been overruled in a Supreme Court case, Griswold against Connecticut, then we have to look carefully at what the consequences are of ignoring the law. We replace what was law and what was reasonable and what was scientific, that is the pill, the abortion pill, approved by the FDA. I believe if this decision turns out wrong, and I'm not talking about the suspension of the effectiveness of the wrong-headed order by that Texas congressman, who is obviously a hack, who feels he can run with the ball and issue an unlawful decision and perhaps further compromise a woman's ability to have an abortion. And he should be driven right out of office. But what is going to happen? If there is a wrong decision here, I think we're going to see a rebirth of civil disobedience. In my lifetime, I've seen it several times. We know about Rosa Parks. We know about the sit-ins in Vietnam. We have seen how it can be effective. Some have studied Gandhi, and we saw what Martin Luther King did in his demonstrations. And these are effective. They're effective in part because the perception is things as we see them are unsupported as a matter of civil liberty, equality, of justice. And so people decide to be civilly disobedient. Going back to Thoreau, meaning challenging a law by submitting your misconduct in violation of that law to illustrate that that law is wrong. Now, but what we see here today is we have a table, a feast of misconduct by our various departments of government, failure to enforce the law. We have resistance to environmental laws. We have ignorance of an effort to thwart our democratic foundation by the attempted overthrow of the government. All of this come together. And so when we don't see prosecutions and we don't see women protected in their rights, and we see black children killed just for the color of their skin, for the fear built into the bigotry of random people who have guns they never should have, then you see as a precursor the possibility of civil disobedience. I support it. I support any person who finds a law and acts righteously to change that law. Now, the Berrigan brothers, they poured paint on draft records and were tried and everything else for it. And they took a vacation for a while to avoid the penalty of their sentence. But we've seen people like the Pentagon Papers leak information that showed the lies of the Vietnam War. This goes on and on. And why does this go on? Because of the First Amendment, because of the corrective action of we the people for what is unjustly done in defiance and ignorance of what the law was and is. So my thinking is we have ahead of us a lot of work for we the people, and it's not so much for any individual. All you have to do is to speak at a water cooler, pay $5 to a campaign of a righteous candidate, show up at a court proceeding, show up at a local rally. You don't even have to get arrested for some of these things. There's a whole science about how to hold these rallies and to avoid accusations like came out of the Chicago 8 trial, that they came there to disturb Chicago in 1968 when protesting the war. And objective findings were that actually what we had was not a riot of protesters, but a riot of police. So that's what I have to say. At this part of my walk, I'm standing near fields, but I want to say goodbye to you for the day against this beautiful background of overhanging clouds and a little chill as the turn of the season. All the best. Bye-bye.